I think it's that time. For what? Another episode of your Re-Educated podcast. Welcome back. It's your host, Gautam Yegapin, alive and blessed to present you with today's conversation. Stay thirsty for knowledge, and I guess some water too. It was my birthday weekend. I'm really glad to be back and continuing this phenomenal season 12. We have a very special guest with us today, Andrea Kane. She is the professor of practice in educational leadership at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education, bringing decades of frontline experience as a K-12 educator and district leader. She is nationally recognized for her visionary leadership in improving school performance, pioneering virtual learning, and advancing environmental education. With extensive experience in rural, urban, and suburban school districts, her work is grounded in the belief that transformational leadership begins in classrooms but must scale to policy, community, and state action. How are you doing today?
I am wonderful. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm glad to be here.
No, of course. I mean, we were just talking about the weather. I mean, it's so, I feel like for me, when I'm having a tough week or it's a gloomy day, I feel like a conversation always feels like a warm cup of tea. So I feel like this is the perfect way to start my week. So thank you for your time and experiences. And I just wanted to say to the listeners, I mean, when I was just reading up about a lot of your work, I feel like one of my deepest concerns, I think, with education sometimes is you have such strong silos where you have people who are in research who only really interact with other academics, and that sometimes feels like a world on its own. And then you learn about the actual bureaucracy structure of schools themselves from the administrators and teachers and the policy world of education, and that's its own world. But to be able to kind of exist at the highest levels in both, I think allows for a particular perspective that can combine the two rather than make them feel like their own separate universe. And so I feel like so much of what you've done has been to do exactly that. And so I feel like I'm extremely excited to hear some of your perspectives today. But I always love starting with people's origin stories. So I want to first know, how did you fall in love with education? How did you know you wanted to devote your life to this space?
Yeah, that's such a great question to start with. I actually started my career as a bank manager. So education is sort of my second career. I always wanted to be a teacher. I grew up in a family, neither of my parents are college educated, but highly valued education. And so I was the first and only in my family to go and graduate from college. But I did it. I knew, that teachers didn't make a lot of money and that kind of thing, even though that's what I wanted to do. So I sort of did a sidestep and I went into banking straight out of college. I majored in economics and was a bank manager for about 5 years. And then I just, I continued to think about, what's important in life. And I grew up as a Sunday school teacher from, sort of middle high school, being a Sunday school teacher assistant and that kind of thing. And that's where I first fell in love with education. And so I decided you might as well do what you love to do. And so I quit the bank and went back to school because I had not gotten a degree in education. Went back to school, got my elementary education certification and degree, and then later my administration. And I knew I was in the right place once I started to actually substitute, because that's what I went from, a bank manager to a substitute teacher. And I absolutely fell in love in elementary school. So that's how I got my start. And I've done a lot of things since then. I even worked as a substitute and a teacher assistant as I was working toward my certifications to teach. And it all served me quite well. I loved it.
Yeah. I mean, when you think back to those days, do you feel like the things that you learned or the perspectives that you learned during your banking profession fed into, in some ways, into how you went about teaching?
Yes. Two of the most important things, to people are their children and their money. And I had the opportunity, to work with both. And so having an opportunity to interact with all types of people in the banking industry, because when I was in it, it started as just banking, but we also turned into a finance company. So not only was I dealing with people and, their savings and that kind of thing, but I'm also dealing with people and loans and things like that and collecting actually for loans. So I had an opportunity to see all sides of people in the banking industry. And it was not very much different, when we deal with people and things that people go through and what's important to people when you're dealing with their children.
Mm. So you started as in banking, then you went to becoming a substitute teacher as you were getting your credentials, and then you were an assistant teacher, and then you taught. Wait, did you teach elementary school?
I taught elementary school and I worked in central office. There's a program called Title One that is a program that provides federal funding for schools and school districts that have a high percentage of students who live in poverty. And so I worked in those types of programs. I worked in school improvement. I was an assistant superintendent for curriculum and instruction, associate superintendent for school improvement, school performance, I should say, chief academic officer in Richmond, and then ultimately superintendent.
So what didn't you do?
I know, right? So when I talk to people, I usually say I've done most of the jobs, at least the categories of jobs at the district level, from elementary on up to superintendent, or I should say substitute to superintendent.
Yeah, I mean, and so where in this journey did your PhD come in?
My PhD came in when I was an assistant superintendent for curriculum and instruction, and I knew that there may be a likelihood that I apply someday to be a superintendent. And I wanted to be sure that I held the highest credentials once and or if I assumed that role. And it was important. And I'm glad that I did things the way that I did things. In fact, I started my doctoral journey the EDD route, and then later decided, well, who knows? I may end up at a university, and PhD will be necessary. I want to really understand how to conduct research and quantitatively. And so I switched my EDD to a PhD, and that turned out to be a really, really good move for me.
Hmm. Okay, I'm ready to get into the meat of the thing that I'm so excited to talk to you because I think, and I wonder if you feel this way, but I do feel with any of these institutions or structures, maybe I can even share a little bit of my experience. Like when I was a student, I feel like in my immediate circle, I was like, all right, all the problems that I face, it's all the teacher's fault. I really dislike these teachers. Why are they making my life so hard? And then you get older and you get a little bit larger of a perspective and you're able to understand even education at a broader level. And then you realize, oh, okay, well, these teachers are restrained by this, this, and this. There's a lot of things going on. And then you have another perspective. And as you slowly get a larger and larger perspective, I feel like there is a new insight you get only by that kind of abstraction that it's really hard to come to when you're working really at the smallest ground level. So I'm curious, one, if you feel that way, and two, if you do, starting from the insights that you picked up as a teacher, I would like to slowly start from the most inner Russian doll and slowly move out and maybe glean a little bit of what you feel like how your insights or perspectives changed as you slowly started to look at education as a larger and larger and larger entity. So maybe we can start with as a teacher.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you said because, when you are only seeing a certain aspect or seeing things from a certain perspective, your outlook or your perspective tends to be kind of narrow, right? So, you might think, why, as a teacher, you might think, why is my principal making me do this? Or is this really important? And, I don't think I need to do this. It's too much. My workload is too heavy. And so I completely understand that. And in some cases, it's right because sometimes there are opportunities for administrators to sort of lighten the load and reduce redundancy so that teachers aren't, as overloaded as they are. But as I began to assume other roles, First, outside of being a teacher, I stepped into a role at central office where I had to help lead several Title I schools in our district. And I began to see things from more of a systemic perspective. So rather than, this narrow viewpoint of things, I had to really look across, our ecosystem and really think about what are the things that are impacting schools and teachers and administrators at different levels. What are the things that we value and hold, as common values and things that need to happen across the ecosystem? And what are the things that really are okay being sort of siloed? Maybe they're, just to allow some opportunity for anonymity and just being able to think through things, on your own or with a smaller group or cohort of people that really, really know, what's happening in a particular grade or in a particular school or a particular community. I think there's value in that. But as you begin to matriculate, you start to look at things, or at least I started to look at things from a more systemic perspective. What are the things that everybody needs to do? Where are the places where we can allow for that opportunity for them to personalize instruction? Because there's value in both of them.
Hmm. So can you maybe explain at each level what do you feel like is the primary concern? What are the things that they're often thinking about? And like, so as a teacher, what were your kind of like the first things that you were thinking about in terms of, was it your students? Was it making sure that you were, reaching a certain mark in your reports, or what was it like?
So, just like most teachers, first and foremost, your priority is your students, right? In your class. And then sort of reach out to the students in your school. But as a teacher, I thought what's important is meeting the needs of my students. When I was a teacher, I taught in a couple different schools, but both of them were Title I schools where students lived in, some of them, a significant amount of poverty and may not have had the resources at home that some other students have to sort of level the playing field when it comes to education. So I was always concerned with what it is that my students need, both academically and, sort of in life. Right. So I had to build relationships with my students so that I could understand what their needs were. I reached out to families to try to understand from their perspective what their needs are, because sometimes there's a difference between what parents want and what children want. So I had to do that first and foremost. But always, as a teacher, you are concerned about meeting expectations, particularly in terms of academic benchmarks. Right. So you have this group, or for me, I had this group of students who may have been considered on several fronts underachieving or underperforming, that has some significant physical needs and some significant psychological needs for some of them. And so I had to think about, where can I merge the two? Where can I set expectations that are reasonable for my students who may very well be missing some very fundamental aspects of education, and meet the needs of, the higher ups that are saying you need to perform with 75% of your students meeting benchmark or meeting proficiency or something like that. So, I took on this warm demander approach, and you probably have heard about that, where we set very high expectations for our students, even though we are focused on building relationships, meeting needs, but not to the point of coddling, right? Because
Mm,
one of the things that, I really found to be beneficial for me as a new teacher coming up was to have an administrator who held me to high expectations, even though my students may have been underperforming, and indeed many of them were. So, you have to find this realistic sort of match between being a high demander, but being a person who humanizes people, humanizes instruction, humanizes leadership, and those relationships with families, so that they know I'm going to push your child, and the students know I'm going to push you, and I'm going to set really high expectations for you, but I'm going to be here and I'm going to support you through this.
Hmm. So at that point, before you learned all these other things and you've had all these other experience, at that point, what did you think was the role of a teacher, or what did you feel like was at the end of the year, if you were like, I did a good job, at that point, what did that necessarily mean to you?
Well, to feel like I did a good job, I really, sort of look for what my students were saying and what my students were doing, right? So if at the end of the year I have indeed increased academic performance, right, and still had the respect of my students and their families and my administrators, and they looked at what the work that I did and said, this is definitely beneficial for our students and for our community, then I felt like I did a good job. It's always important to me what people think about the work that I do, because I want to do a good job. Sometimes, you learn how to sort of filter what's important in those messages, and what's not going to be important for my own growth. Um, but what's important is how my students are performing. And if indeed I feel like they are better prepared for the next grade, for the next aspect of their life, than they were when I first got them.
Mm,
So it's both, sort of academic as well as, psychological, if you will, because I feel it's important to treat children, and, any adult with a great deal of respect and empathy, and really listen to what it is that they're saying, even if if they don't agree with me, right? We
yeah.
had plenty of opportunities to, debate and make sense of what I'm saying and what somebody else is saying. But the proof is when student performance increases and they are better positioned as human beings.
Do you feel like there's a relationship between those two?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Mm,
There are so many opportunities in schools to make a difference in children's lives, whether we're talking, 4-year-olds in pre-K, or seniors in 12th grade. There are so many opportunities to teach life lessons, and to be an example even when you mess up, as
mm,
an adult. And, sometimes apologies are important. Children need to see adults apologize. Children need to see adults say, "Oh, I made a mistake. I probably shouldn't have done that. Let me see how I can work to correct that." They need to know that we're human beings and we are indeed fallible. We're teachers, we're administrators, but we're people.
yeah.
And when we help children to recognize that, then they feel more free to make mistakes, and that's how we grow, right?
Yeah.
Make mistakes, recover from them, exercise our resilience. All of those things are important, and I think very, very highly connected. It's a part of how we humanize education, how we humanize instruction and leadership.
100%. And I guess so so then from a teacher you became a principal, right? Is that correct? And
Well,
so
yeah,
that
there was maybe a stop or two in between with other jobs, but ultimately, yeah,
eventually to the okay. And so
yeah.
now could you explain, so it's actually just thinking about that right now as we were talking. It's almost been 200 episodes, but I we have kept for some reason I don't even know if I was doing this intentionally. We haven't actually spoken about schools on this show yet. It has been so philosophical about the theory of education itself. What is learning? What is knowledge? Why is it important? I realized just in this conversation and in a previous conversation this season that I've kept it at that level for so long that I actually don't fully know how a school actually functions. And I'm like, okay, I think in my brain, I wrote down here, I was like in big letters, I was like, next season has to be on the infrastructure of schools because I don't know how they work, which is shocking. But can you define a little bit more of what exactly it is a principal does, and how are your responsibilities as a principal now different than that of a teacher?
Sure. So one of the things that is most significant for principals is being an instructional leader, right? So anything that has to do with supporting teachers, understanding curricula, understanding how to interpret data so that we can make improvements to not only student performance, but educator performance, all of those things from selecting curricula, from selecting materials of instruction, all of those things have to do with instructional leadership. Right. And so that's one of the most significant roles of a principal. And of course, for teachers, they are implementing that instruction and they're doing the same. They're understanding curricula, they're understanding the standards and how sort of to unpack standards so that they can apply those standards to instruction in classrooms. A lot of this is, I'm going to put on my curriculum instruction and assessment hat right now. A lot of these things are very interrelated. So when you talk about curriculum, instruction, and assessment, it's sort of, think of it as an infinity loop. They all have to be connected. Right. And they
Mm,
all are connected to standards, state standards, national standards, those kinds of things. And that's what we test children on. Right. So it's all connected. So when people say, oh my gosh, they're teaching to the test. Well, my response is, well, they better be, because what else are they teaching? I'm not saying teach verbatim, but I'm saying you have to teach the standards, right? That instruction is built on, that curricula is built on, and that assessments ought to be built on. So if indeed the three of those things are connected, why wouldn't we be teaching, right? For the test? Because why would we test children on things that we haven't taught them? So, yes, all of that has to be connected. All of that is important. And as a principal, that instructional leadership is one of the most important things. Is it the only thing? Absolutely not. Principals are definitely responsible for community engagement, drawing the community in, moving on in an outward pattern, sort of putting students in the community and collaborating that way. So it goes both ways, in and outward facing. Principals are responsible for a budget. So they have a fiduciary responsibility. They have to make sure that they are using the funds that are allotted to their school in a way that is going to meet the needs of the students and the educators in their school building, which also should align to district-wide strategic goals. So it's all connected. So you've got fiduciary responsibility, you have instructional responsibility, you have responsibility sort of as a transactional leader in some aspects when we talk about ensuring bell schedules are in the right order. So we're making sure that we have substitutes to take care of classrooms that where a teacher is absent. We have to make sure that we do hiring and sort of monitoring performance of not only students, but also of educators. It is a very, very complex role, that of a building principal. And for the most part, you are obviously concerned with what's happening in your school building, but you also are beginning to have concern about what happens in the entire district because it should all be aligned.
mm. So who is the principal necessarily responsible to? Like, who does the principal now report to, or is there somebody who's the next person, I guess, in that?
Yeah, so in larger districts, there are frequently principal supervisors. They have different names in different districts. Some would be assistant superintendents, some might be, different types of leaders. It just doesn't, whatever you call it, there are principal supervisors in larger districts. In smaller districts, that role of supervising principals may sort of be distributed between different district level leaders, or maybe even the superintendent in really small districts might directly supervise principals. It really depends on the organizational structure of each district. But there is definitely someone who is going to be responsible for monitoring the performance of principals, monitoring the performance of students in schools in a particular region of that district, and ensuring that there's an alignment between what happens at the school and how the central office responds in terms of supporting schools.
Mm. So what is one thing you feel like is a perspective that you learned from being a principal that you didn't necessarily have as a teacher?
It's that bigger systemic viewpoint perspective about how things should align and how indeed there are some things that everybody needs to be doing, and there are some things that are going to be specific to my particular school, right? As a
Yeah.
principal. Yeah.
So I think one of the things that has been coming up a lot, and I'm really curious to hear your take on this because I think let's say hypothetically, with not the standards necessarily, but the ways that we assess the standards. Let's say as a teacher or as a principal, you don't necessarily agree with them. You don't necessarily agree that the measurements that we use to make sure that students are learning to quote unquote lead a good life or whatever it is that we believe the aim of education should be is not actually accurate. How does a principal then respond to something like that?
Yeah. So that's an I would look at that as an opportunity, right? To begin to unpack what teachers, because it's so important, what teachers believe need to be done in classrooms, because it's going to happen with the teacher. It's not necessarily going to happen with the principal. It's going to happen with the teacher. So it's important to hear what teachers are saying. And if for me as a principal, if there's a way that I can make things happen in the way that teachers, as long as it's viable, right, in the way that teachers think it should be done, then I'm going to do it. Let me give you, for example. In one school where I was the principal, we were relentless with our data and understanding where students were performing, what they needed to do to improve their performance and those sort of things. And I had a really, really super good group of teachers, and they decided that if we sort of grouped our students a little bit differently in fourth and fifth grades, then we could allow teachers, get this, to teach what they really were passionate about teaching. In elementary schools, teachers teach pretty much everything. You teach reading, you teach math, you teach science, you teach social studies. That's usually how it is in elementary schools. Unless you have larger elementary schools, you might sort of do a little bit of departmentalization and have certain teachers teaching math and that like that. But in this particular school, we had teachers who were really thinking not only about how students were performing, but they were thinking about the sort of demeanor of students and priorities that students held and, what students wanted, that kind of thing. And so we decided to allow certain teachers to teach certain things. Some teachers loved math and they were good at it and their scores showed it. Some teachers loved English language arts. They were good at it and their scores showed it. So we regrouped our students to do sort of a rotation between teachers on that grade level who were passionate about what they wanted to teach. So I might be a fourth grade teacher and only teach math all day long because that's my jam. That's the thing that I like and I do well with it. Well, if students do well with that, then that's what we're going to do. So we changed our grouping and we did something a little unorthodox in elementary schools, and it worked for us. But when it stopped working for us, then we decided to pivot and make a change. So these are the things we still had a focus on English language arts and math performance, just like we did across our district. But in my school, I wanted to allow teachers that level of autonomy to teach it in the way that they thought was most effective for our students. And so there's
Mm.
that mix between having a responsibility systemically, to the district and a responsibility locally to the teachers at my particular school. So we were able to work things out that way. We informed parents what our plan was and encouraged parents to really closely monitor their students and their student performance and how students were feeling about school and classes and teachers. And things worked out well for us because we sort of collaborated, put our heads together, and thought about what was going to be best for our students.
Mm. I mean, I have a
So
few more questions. Yeah, sorry.
I was just going to say, so it's sort of, the out of the box kind of thinking. It doesn't have to be something that, sort of is drawn on some kind of theory or studies that you've read. Your study is your students in that school, right?
Mm,
That's what you're studying as a teacher
mm.
and an administrator.
So I just want to, because I keep forgetting what the exact order is. So after principal and after a few more years, did you go become an assistant superintendent?
Hmm. I
Cool.
did. Yeah.
And so assistant superintendents work for the city?
So I was in a county, and we work for the school district. So all of these positions are within a school district that is, situated locally, with funding from, your local government, whatever that is, whether it's your county or your state, and a little bit from the federal government.
Okay. And so now you're no longer just managing one school, but you're managing all the schools in the county. And
Hmm.
so you've now added a much higher level of complexity.
Yeah.
What was that experience like, and what do you feel like? I mean, first of all, before it just fast, it's amazing. One thing is, I feel like there's a lot of ways we can critique education and completely valid, but it is so amazing that we're able to somehow create these systems that are able to educate millions and millions of people in a relatively effective way where people are able to learn how to read, able to do basic arithmetic, however you pronounce that. But I mean, it is not a simple challenge at all. If you were to start at the dawn of humanity and somehow just tell them you're able to create these massive institutions that can do and serve so much and include so many people in the process. I mean, it's truly mind blowing. Did you have that moment where you're like, this scale is insane?
Yes, I certainly did. When you go from being a principal, sort of mayor of your own little kingdom, right, to being a district level leader, you definitely recognize the complexities, because each community, each individual school, and in one district, I had about 125 schools.
Oh my
Each,
God.
yeah, each individual school district has its own personality, or each individual school community has its own personality. Its leader has his or her own way of leading. And somehow you have to get everybody on the same page with regard to how we're going to approach instruction. And I'm saying approach instruction because I think that we absolutely, as district leaders, have to leave space for autonomy where schools can do the things that are important in that particular community. So that's why we have strategic plans, right, across a school district where we've studied our, aggregate data, and we understand where students are performing, what they need to show improvement in, and so forth. And so we put a plan together to say what it is that we're going to do to increase student performance, to build educator capacity, to do this all within a certain budget. And that's important. But we also have to recognize that there are things that each individual school needs to be able to do, in their own way. So go back to Common Core. I was an assistant superintendent for curriculum when Common Core state standards came about. We had numerous sort of town hall gatherings with parents and community members and politicians, of course, other educators, to sort of understand, number one, what the changes to the standards were. Number two, what it meant for instruction in each one of our schools at each level, what was going to change, and as importantly, what was going to stay the same, because people need to be able to hang on to something that doesn't change, right? Or that hasn't changed, especially amidst, a huge transition like Common Core state standards. And those are the things that were important: listening and being clear, very crystal clear about what the changes are and what the changes, what's going to stay the same. And I was in Maryland at the time. We were number one in the country in terms of standards and aligning our standards to curriculum and assessment at the time. And so we had standards that were very important to us that may not have been present in Common Core standards. So Maryland State Department of Education passed standards that we held on to because we felt as a state these were important in addition to adopting Common Core standards. So that allowed us some level of autonomy across the state, across school districts. That was important at that time. So, that transition to district level leadership just really, really brought home how important it is to, communicate clearly, to ensure that people understand that yes, there are changes that we are going to be held accountable to, but there are some things that are important that are going to stay the same. And I'm going to be here for you. I'm going to support you. I'm going to make sure that you get trained in understanding those standards, how to unpack them, and what needs to happen in the classrooms. And for principals to understand how to observe and evaluate what needs to be happening in classrooms. So all of those things are important and really, really broaden my perspective regarding, what's important in education.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to ask you this question later, but it's one of the ones that I think are really important because you mentioned about getting on the same page. And I think in if there was a few things I would really have to highlight that I've learned in these, 4 or 5 years of exploring education is how many different pages there are in approaching education. I mean, there are so many different ways. In the most fundamental question, which is what do you think is the purpose of all of this? Like, we're doing all this work. What really is the purpose? What are our goals and what are our aims? Not on like on a metric or institutional level, but truly at the individual to individual level, what are our goals? And when you ask that, depending on who you talk to, people have very vast, like very differing beliefs on why we educate. And having to get everyone on the same page, I think, is one of the most hard things to do. And I have talked to a lot of people who work at different levels of schools and things who, when I ask them, do you have spaces where everyone in the community comes together to truly have these philosophical discussions to some extent on what are we really doing here? And so often I hear that the answer is no, and there's not a lot of time. So it's sometimes easier to turn to the metrics and to graduation rates because those are numbers that you can really quantify. We're having a much longer conversation and an open-ended conversation on what really is the point of education can sometimes be very hard to facilitate. And so when we talk about getting on the same page, what are some of the things that you have tried? What are some of the things that you feel like work and what doesn't work?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so, there are some things where it's important to be on the same page, and some things where maybe not so much. I mean, when you think about the purpose, something as broad and sort of philosophical as the purpose of education, I teach a class called School and Society. And we start out with the foundations of education and all of that and the purpose of education. And there's a couple of schools of thought when you talk about several pages, right? There are so many pages, so I sort of smile because there absolutely are. There's a school of thought where you look at education as a private good, right? Education could be looked at to build my capacity to earn high wages, right? As an individual. Education may be important for me as an education because it maybe helps me to think about things in a different way, sort of on a more global perspective and what's good, but basically the only person benefiting that from that is me, maybe the people that I'm closest to. But then there's another way to look at education, sort of from a view of public education as public goods, right? Education for the sake of it, sort of building capacity for society and helping society to sort of overcome challenges and to have broader perspectives about things and not so much to sort of stratify us because education could be looked at as a means of stratification, right? Some students are sort of funneled into sort of tracks that may prepare them for working with their hands, if you will, if they're going to be plumbers or if they're going to be electricians or carpenters, that sort of thing, um, which is not wrong or bad, right? That's for some students, not for every student. There's another perspective where some students are sort of tracked to secondary or to higher ed pathways. And we know that these students are going to go to college and probably graduate school, and some are going to go on to earn doctoral degrees. And so education is going to stratify in that sense. Some are going to take jobs that are going to keep them here. Some are expected to take jobs that are going to have them as thinkers and higher earners. Education does do that. There's a perspective that we need to be concerned about in those terms. But there's also, so private goods, public goods, stratification. You can have your idea, you can have your perspective that does not have to be in alignment with mine. That's an area where we don't have to be on the same page. Nobody has to agree, right?
Mm,
However, we do have to agree as educators that we are going to teach the standards that students are going to be held accountable to. And indeed, in some states still, teachers' evaluations, principals' evaluations include some aspect of student performance. Right. So there is a very real level of accountability there. So there are some spaces where we really do have to get on the same page about how we're going to teach children. Right. So that's why I
mm,
say there are some places where we do have to get on the same page and some places where maybe not so much. And we can still do our job as educators, even if I believe that education is about public good, about building capacity of all society. An educated society is a society where people have more opportunities. That's my belief. But if you believe that education is about helping you to get ahead, and it doesn't matter if anybody else does, you still can hold that belief, right? But as
yeah,
educators, we have to make sure that we are teaching children in to the expectation that we are being held accountable to.
fair. Would you say that the standards themselves implicitly carry along some of those principles that you possibly stated? And so, if your principles or values strongly counter those that are implicitly in the standards, won't you have a sense of like, these standards don't feel right to me?
I think that that is possible in some subjects. I think things like that are more concrete, like math and science and those kinds of things, there are standards that don't necessarily, incorporate opportunities for sort of interpretation in terms of who's going to benefit and who's not going to benefit. You need to learn how to count to 10 by kindergarten, period, or 20 by in kindergarten, period. No, there's no value associated with that. It's just what it is. But when you get to things like history, right? When you have an opportunity in English language arts to choose novels that students are going to be reading, right? There are definitely standards that students need to, accomplish, but how we get there is the place where it can be value laden. If I choose to use the textbook The Hate You Give, right? And use that as a way for students to think about student advocacy and how it's important for all voices to be heard and that kind of thing. That's one thing. But somebody else might say, I would choose not to use that book because it has racial undertones or something like that, or may spark a discussion in my class that I'm not prepared to manage as a teacher. Right.
Mm,
That's that teacher's perspective. If the district allows that type of autonomy, so be it. But if you're a teacher who's engaged and who is, interested in sort of, pushing your students to think about and have these conversations that they are likely to have outside of school and to help prepare them for these conversations, then then it could be argued that there's some value laden issues with those, but it's not necessarily the standard. It's how we teach the standard, how we get to student mastery for that particular standard. Do you see what I'm saying?
yeah, So okay, yes, I 100% get what you're saying, and I'm curious what you think about this because at least from a student perspective, I feel like this is maybe what changed over my life. Let's take math for example, or even I think science is another great one, where I think if we think about science or math as these like static things that we understand and we just kind of uh, label it as some apolitical and something that is just to be understood. Like this is what an atom is, and that doesn't really, there's no real interpretation to it. I think in that sense, to some extent, that may be true, but I feel like the real juice of all of each one of these subjects, like the stuff that really is where the awe or wonder comes out, is understanding so in science, for example, I think one of the most interesting questions that come out from understanding science is really asking, what does progress mean? What does the progress of healthcare look like? What does that mean? Is it important? To what extent do we care about this? Same with mathematics. Is mathematics an understanding of the universe to some extent, or is it a constructed thing that humans have made that we are now understanding? I feel like even in these things, there are these really fundamental questions that actually deeply shape one, how we interact with it, but also how we do many other things in our life. And so it's not that those types of questions can only come out in when reading literature and things like that, which I feel like often is how at least my schooling experiences was made to feel, where like this type of interpretation only exists in the humanities, but it equally exists in the sciences and the maths as well. But I feel like for that reason, to really get to those like profound questions sometimes moves away from the things that you can quantify because these are like much longer conversations and things that you have to internally go through that you it's so difficult to be like, well, they can do some algebra, you can, okay, done, check it. And so I feel like we miss that sauce in all of this.
I see exactly what it is that you're saying. And sometimes I think those conversations are, there's a lot of things about that. You can create an opportunity, create an environment in classrooms where it's safe to have those kinds of conversations. And that takes a teacher who understands that there are opportunities for students to think differently about those kinds of things. What's our existence? Why are we here? I can remember in high school having a teacher, we used to have this unit on what is beauty, what is truth, those
Are
philosophical, right? Those
yeah.
philosophical kinds of conversations. And it wasn't necessarily about a right and a wrong answer. It was about how we can communicate, how we see the world, right?
Yes.
And that's important. Is it quantifiable? Absolutely, it's quantifiable because I can say to you as a teacher, I can ask you to write an essay on what is beauty, what is truth, and you need to justify 3 reasons, right? I'm not judging you on the reasons that you give. I'm judging you on whether or not you justify it, right? This is your reason, and this is how you justify it. You still have an opportunity to state your piece. You can say what's important to you, and whether or not anybody agrees with it, it doesn't make a difference. It's can you communicate it? Can you communicate it effectively? And can you justify it?
Yeah. And I mean I'm curious just as a conversation because I want to know what you think about this because I feel like the reason ChatGPT can be so as an entity so terrifying in some ways for some people is that it actually reveals that from the beginning, my ability to communicate an idea doesn't actually speak on how embodied that idea is within me. So if you were to ask me what beauty is, for example, if let's say I've read all the books, I know how to articulate myself well, I could maybe act like I have this profound thesis on what beauty is. But it is only when you wake up and you have to look at a sunset and maybe those thoughts come up in your mind where you truly have to sit with yourself and be like, what is my relationship to this thing? And I think that like and that's the same thing with math and with it's not just how competent am I, it is also what is my relationship to the thing that I'm doing. And I think that in its essence only you can there is all I feel like there's no way to somehow quantify that. And we've kind of lost that uh we don't value that at all.
And I want to add to that. I agree with you. Yes. And do we necessarily need to quantify that? When we think
Yeah.
about, at higher ed, at those places, and in some aspects of, maybe 11th, 12th graders, they can articulate those kinds of things. Or maybe they have had an experience where they can relate to those sort of things. But maybe as a fifth grader or a seventh or eighth grader, I've not had those experiences and I can't speak to those kinds of things. And so, you can give me an opportunity to say how I feel, my perspective about it, but the relatability is certainly not going to be the same as maybe a undergrad, right? Or a graduate student. It's not the same thing. And so the expectation wouldn't be that they can relate and communicate those kinds of things as well as maybe somebody who has had some experience and been engaged in those kinds of things. So maybe it's an opportunity to understand what students think. To hear them, to allow them to articulate it in whatever way works for them, but maybe not go into evaluating it. Just maybe information seeking, maybe to better relate to the student so that you can sort of have a better understanding of them, which is also valuable.
Yeah. And I think this touches on the autonomy piece you were talking about earlier, because I think these types of conversations, the beautiful thing about them is that you don't necessarily have control. And you talked about that earlier with some of the literature that a English teacher might use or a history teacher, where when you expose people to something that's maybe a little bit more personal or difficult, you don't necessarily have full control of where that conversation goes, what ideas come out of it, whether you'll be able to really understand what another person is going through. And I feel this all the time. I mean, I grew up in the Bay where every school was 80% of the children in the city that I grew up in are children of immigrants. And so the teacher has no capacity, it's impossible to understand the unique experiences that each one of those students had. They were all from all over the world. It's impossible to. So when you have difficult conversations that open the space, now you also become a learner where you have to be like, I know nothing about your life. Now you teach me something. But that can only happen when there's autonomy to kind of stray away, I guess, from a very rigid, like this needs to happen by this point, so that these type of more, I would want to call it magical experiences can happen. So how do you navigate between how much autonomy? Because the more it feels like in my head, the more autonomy there is, you don't necessarily have control of whether that autonomy will actually lead to an improved result. Because autonomy is kind of beautiful in that way, where it's like you don't actually have control anymore. And so, how do you navigate between those two? How much autonomy to give, and what happens when that autonomy doesn't lead to necessarily growths and scores, but it leads to growth in other ways?
That's a really important point that you're making, because there are lots of ways to look at growth, and it may not necessarily be growth that shows up in academic performance, right? But at the start of our conversation, we started talking about, what the expectation is for, purpose of education and that sort of thing, and I mentioned that there are different things, that people have to be concerned about. And bottom line, I guess for me, is I'm thinking about one, control is a farce, right? As a leader of many years, you can give the illusion of being in control of some things, but in actuality, we're dealing with living human beings who are unpredictable. And you're absolutely right. We may not have control, right, of how things turn out. So I think that it's important to say, this is the expectation, right? This is where students need to be. And how you get them there, I'm going to leave you some level of autonomy, right? If there's room for that. And let me explain why I say that. In certain schools and certain school districts, there's an expectation for an approach to teaching, right? Maybe a school district believes in culturally responsive teaching. Maybe they believe in the idea of understanding students' cultures, maybe not intimately, because if you have so many, if you have, a significant percentage of your population, like the example you gave, with students with varying degrees of backgrounds that are not familiar to me, then I'm going to want to learn something about them, but I'm not going to have intricate knowledge, right? But I want to figure out what I can use from that student's culture to bridge that gap between what they already know and what I'm trying to teach them that's going to be new for them. If I can better understand that student's background and incorporate that kind of thing about their culture into my instruction, then that's what I want to do. There are districts that find value, right, in that. And so the expectation for instruction would be to sort of make those bridges, right? There are other districts, not so much. They might give you the standards, they give you the curricula, they give you an essential question, an objective, and that kind of thing, and then you follow sort of a script, right? So there's not a lot of autonomy there, but in the former, the one that I talked about at first, there is. And so I think for me, there needs to be some kind of a medium. If I say that these are the standards, our state holds us accountable, yes, you have to teach the standards. But how you get to that can be, your call. And that's the level of autonomy that I'm talking about. I have spoken with so many teachers that have innovative ways of teaching things that maybe I hadn't thought about. I have observed instruction where I thought, "Oh my gosh, what motivated you to think to do this lesson in the way that you did? I would have never thought about it like that." So those are the opportunities for those sort of, you just called them sort of these magical moments in classrooms, or these teachable moments that may not have been in the curriculum, but are still important for students to know. As it stands, as a practitioner and now a university professor, I find that my students really, really enjoy hearing about my experiences and how I handle things as a practitioner so that we can apply what we're learning in the classroom to what they actually are going to be doing when they're out in the field. So there's that sort of connection, that bridge between theory, if you will, and practice. And so that's another opportunity to marry the two. So there still is autonomy, right? It's how we approach it. There can be high expectations, there can be standards, but how we get to them may look different across schools, across districts, across states with the same
Mm.
standards.
I'm just thinking about the fact that I have maybe 10 more hours of questions to ask you, but I'm like, I just want to be mindful of your time. Do you feel like you have another 10 minutes with us?
I have another 10 minutes.
Okay, because we haven't even gone to the university part. We haven't gone to the parts where you've worked with curriculum and instruction, and I feel like there's just, I mean, it's magnificent. You've seen education in so many different perspectives, and I feel like that's a very rare thing. But I think one thing that I also want to ask you is, because you've navigated both of these environments well, and you kind of made this distinction between theory and practice, which I think very much exists from both sides, what do you feel like practitioners would benefit perhaps from being around more academics, thinking about education more theoretically, and then vice versa? What do you feel like academics would learn a lot from being at a school, working as a principal, or in both ways? What is one thing that the other side could learn from?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great question. I find, especially in a university like University of Pennsylvania, which is well known for its outstanding research, I think it is important that we understand what the research says. I think it's important that we understand the various populations that research occurs in. And what is it that we can take away from research? Because that's the point. What can we take away from the research to apply in actual authentic, learning situations? And that's where I come in, right? As a professor of practice, having been a practitioner for 30 years, and now at the university level, it's important that we sort of bridge those connections. But one thing that I always stress to my students is, what's written in research is not always applicable in your particular school setting, right?
Mm,
So there's a lot of research that's going to tell us that we should do A, B, C, and D, right? If you want whatever high outcome. Well, maybe in your school or in your classroom, it doesn't pan out that way. Maybe there are some extenuating circumstances with students' backgrounds, the knowledge level of the teachers, the beliefs of the community that will not make what you read about applicable in that community. Right. So understanding the difference between the theory and what can actually be applied is going to be pivotal for practitioners because everything that you read about, you're not going to be able to apply at your particular school, right? Whether it's because values are different, priorities are different, students are different, maybe the population, the sample size, and the studies that you read were different from the students at my particular school, or the teachers and administrators at my school don't have the same values. All of those things make a difference, and we have to be able to discern what's going to work and what's not going to work. And why waste your time if it's not going to work? I mean, it's good to know, but if it's not going to work in your actual situation, is it worth your time?
Hmm.
And so, that discernment, I think, is what's important. And I think, the examples that I give, and, some of the experiences that I've had, and trying to connect those experiences with what students want to do, in their futures, because not everybody in my courses intends to be a teacher or an administrator. There are many opportunities for students to work in capacities that are student facing or public facing, that are not delivering instruction or not directly, as an instructional leader. And so we think about those kinds of things. And I think, and I hear from all of my students so that I can understand what they plan to do. It may not end up it may not be where they end up, but where they plan to be, and sort of try to make connections to that work with, the topics that we talk about in my classes, and the studies that we read, and the scenarios that we go through. So, all of those things are important.
Wow. I mean, if there's ever more time, I would love to have you on again. I mean, there is so much more to get into, and I feel like learning more anecdotes and thinking about real life examples, because I think for my example, as I said earlier, I feel like I've been in this world of philosophy and thinking about education so much, but having to marry that with what education is like today, what schools are like today, not just thinking about what it can be, but really like what are the ground implications of the difficulties of implementation, of scaling. You could have the best idea, but when it comes to scaling, all of a sudden it no longer can be done in the same way. But that wisdom can only come not through theory, not through research, but by having to actually implement the perfect idea that you think you have. And I think that is amazing that you've been able to do both. And I feel like there's probably so much more to get into, but thank you so much for your time.
It has been my pleasure talking with you. And sure, it would be great to have another conversation at another time. But I really appreciate you, and I've enjoyed our conversation today.
Yeah. And I want to say thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. There's a lot more episodes coming your way this week, but as per usual, stay re-educated.